All right, well, my clock just switched over to 10 o'clock. So I would like to introduce Camilla from EOR. She is our sponsor this hour and will be moderating and hosting this hour. And I believe she's going to share some information about EOR. That was one thing we wanted to make sure we included this year at the conference, since we don't have that trade show and don't have an opportunity to visit, as much with our sponsors and the people that support us. So Camilla, I'll turn it over to you, and thank you so much for being here today.
Thank you so much, Emily. I appreciate the opportunity. Welcome, everybody. It looks like we have a lot of people participating in this track, which I think is excellent, because I think this is going to be a really informative presentation and panel discussion for all of you to participate in. I wanted to say, I didn't know if there were any housekeeping announcements, Emily, but during the discussion, if anybody has any questions that they'd like to ask, they can always use the chat function, and we'll monitor that to make sure that your questions or your comments are addressed.
Yes, so, and you can also, we'll also watch the raised hand feature. So if on the bottom of the screen, there's a reactions button, and if you hover on that, there's a raised hand. And so feel free, if you'd rather just voice your opinion, voice your question, we can do that too.
Absolutely, thank you, Emily. So my name is Camilla Correll, and I'm a water resources engineer with Emmons and Olivier Resources. And I do a lot of watershed district representation, as well as representing municipalities. So not only do I do traditional engineering design work, but I'm also involved in a lot of planning and watershed management planning work, which is related to the topic that we will be talking about today. As a sponsor and host of this session, we've been asked to share a little bit about EOR and the work that we do. So first, I'm going to share a 2-minute introductory video, which we put together for last year's MOD presentation that we think is really fun. And then after that video, I will go through a couple slides. I don't want to take a lot of your time, but a couple slides highlighting some of the work that we've been involved in internally as an organization, and then externally for our clients. So I'll just go through a couple of slides. So to start, I'm just going to share my screen and share. Let me see if I can find it. I'm sorry. I wanted to just share the introductory video that we have for you.
Are you looking for the share button?
No, I'm not looking for the share button. I'm looking for some our video.
In the 15 different buttons that show up once you say you want to share.
Right, even though I minimize them.
Yep.
Okay, there it is. Okay, so let's see if I can get this to work. Oh, can you hear this?
We can hear it. It's a little bit soft, but we cannot see it yet. I think what we're hearing is it just coming through your computer because the sound is in your room.
How's this?
Oh, now we can see it. Maybe, oh, I am not hearing it. Why don't you stop it and start it from the beginning again? Last time that happened.
Did you hear it for a moment?
I think I was only hearing it through your own microphone. It didn't sound like it was connecting.
Okay. Let me try one more time, and if not, then we will just forego this piece. Here is the button that I forgot to click that says share. I can be the guinea pig for everybody else who's going to try and share things later. Oh, I'm sorry. I'm going to just skip that introduction, and I'm just going to share the presentation.
We'll make sure that we get your video out and everything. Yeah, it's always tricky, especially when you're doing multiple multimedia stuff, and we'll make sure we get that shared for sure.
Absolutely. Thank you. Mm-hmm. Okay, so hopefully everybody's sitting in the right track. This is the Translating Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion in Systems Change in Policy and Planning. And so what we wanted to do was just highlight a couple of efforts that EOR has been involved in, again, internally and externally. So for the last 2 years, we've all been participating in these virtual sessions because we are in the middle of a pandemic. But right before the pandemic, EOR moved into its new St. Paul headquarters. And we haven't really had a lot of time to be in that space because we've all been working from home. So a couple of things that we've been working on internally that we wanted to highlight is a wellness initiative, which we took as a result of burnout that a number of employees were facing, balancing both their work life with their home life at home. So these wellness initiatives are being incorporated in a number of the activities that we are doing on a day-to-day basis, and I'm sure will carry forward as we all come back into the office together. We've also been making deeper connections with the community groups in our new office location in St. Paul, even though we're not able to meet with them in person. We have been participating in company-wide diversity, equity, and inclusion trainings, which everybody has benefited from by increasing the awareness and the knowledge and communication on these topics. And we are continuing to learn more about DEI and recognize that this will be an ongoing effort moving forward and something that all of us will be better about. And then each Friday we gather as a company to have what we call Friday Talks, where we share information on topics related to our work, both internal and external. And these talks help us stay connected at a time of remote work and better understanding the challenges and solutions that our coworkers as well as our clients are encountering as we continue to work in this remote setting. So moving on to some of the projects that we've been involved with recently, I wanted to highlight the work that we did for the Capital Region Watershed District, where we assisted them in the renovation of a former industrial building to create new interactive spaces that are welcoming for district staff as well as visitors. The renovation includes stormwater management, but went further to provide educational features, areas of community gathering, and accessible stormwater management BMPs to convey the mission of the Watershed District and their connection to the community that they serve. We were also involved in transforming the outdoor landscape at Central High School in St. Paul. This project was a community effort that reshaped the urban landscape of the school to improve students' daily experiences outdoors, as well as to connect them to the vibrant community that embraces this school. Design of the outdoor spaces included engagement with students, as well as staff and parent groups who helped shape the design of the stormwater management plan, as well as the curricular activities associated with these stormwater management practices. So this was a very exciting and engaging project. And then finally, under the category of water, I wanted to highlight the Rose, where we provided civil and landscape architecture design for a redevelopment project, which provides a mix of market rate affordable housing units near downtown Minneapolis. And the stormwater management design for this apartment complex defines vibrant outdoor social areas, extends residents' living experience into the outdoors through community gardens and outdoor gathering spaces, and emphasizes a wide spectrum of life stages and economic housing needs. Under the category of ecology, we have been engaging the public in the Duluth area natural resources management plan. So as the city of Duluth takes stock of its multitude of outdoor spaces and parks, it's been looking for engagement from those neighborhoods, business communities, and residents that they're hoping, well, that they already know are very good stewards of these spaces, but are hoping to expand that stewardship to help the city better manage these resources. And they've also been looking at opportunities for making these spaces more accessible and welcoming to the BIPOC community. We've also been working with solar site developers and helping them quantify the multitude of benefits that the conversion of land use to solar site development affords a community, including improved water quality, increased wildlife and pollinator habitat, and things like urban heat island, reducing the impacts of urban heat island effects. And finally, under the category of community, we have also been working with the City of Rochester on its comprehensive surface water management plan and helping them to engage numerous stakeholders and neighborhoods and communities in the development of this plan, so that as the city looks at risks and impacts related to climate change, they're going beyond the traditional storm sewer infrastructure capacity issues that a plan might typically address, to include other infrastructural, environmental, and socioeconomic concerns which impact this community. And finally, we are also working on the St. Louis River One Watershed, One Plan. This is not only the largest planning area in the state of Minnesota, but it's the first One Watershed, One Plan to have First Nations at the table on the policy committee and a very integral part of the planning process. So we've been working very hard to make sure that those voices are heard throughout the planning process, as well as all of the other communities, or the diverse communities that are a part of this planning area. So with that, I will stop sharing my screen again so we can all look at each other, or those that have their, oh my God, I'm having such technical difficulties this morning. Okay, so here we are again. And I would like to take this time to introduce our speakers. Okay, so today we have Rosie Russell from Emmons and Olivier Resources. Rosie is a colleague of mine and helps me with a lot of the planning efforts, including the two that I just shared with you for the City of Rochester and the St. Louis River Watershed. So you'll hear a little bit more about those projects. She has worked with EOR for 5 years and currently serves as an environmental planner for watersheds across the state of Minnesota. Rosie is also conducting research as a master's student at the University of Minnesota, exploring techniques for evaluating the social impact of food justice organizations. As Rosie and her colleagues at EOR were exploring the landscape for new relationships and perspectives to better serve the needs of the communities where our clients operate, they became connected with Belinda and Rebecca, who will also be presenting today. Belinda Gardner has been a Watershed District Administrative Assistant for over 5 years. She's with the Capital Region Watershed District. She was recently appointed as the Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion Coordinator. As the DEI Coordinator, Belinda leads and coordinates the implementation of the district's diversity plan. Welcome, Belinda. And then finally, we have Rebecca Walker, who is a PhD student at the University of Minnesota's Humphrey School of Public Affairs. She studies urban planning and conducts research at the intersection of green infrastructure, housing, and equity. Welcome, Rebecca. I am super looking forward to hearing your talk, so I will turn it over to the two of you, or the three of you, I'm sorry.
Thank you, Camilla. I'm just going to share my screen here and start presenting. So thanks everyone for being here today. Belinda, Rebecca, and I are very much looking forward to this presentation and having this conversation with you. So our presentation today is called Translating Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion into Systems Change in Policy and Planning. So to start, we wanted to do a little bit of grounding. Who are we and why are we here today? So I'm here to bring people together. As Camilla said, I've had the great opportunity to get to know Belinda and Rebecca through the search for new tools and new perspectives that can really enhance our ability to understand and fill those gaps that we've been learning about over the course of the last couple of years during the pandemic. And so it's been a pleasure to get to know them. And I think having the three of us together will really make this conversation so much more rich than just having one perspective at the table. So Belinda is here to celebrate a success story, which you'll hear about later. And Rebecca is here to share new knowledge. As a PhD student, she's been learning a lot about this topic. And so now we'd like to hear from the audience, and you'll see throughout this presentation, we will have audience reflections. And so we're going to start with this reflection, which is, why are you here with us today? And we'll be using a platform called Jamboard. And I'm just going to put a link in the chat so that everyone can open up the Jamboard. And if you're familiar with Jamboard, when you open this up, and are you all still seeing my screen? Yep, okay, great. So, and you're seeing the Jamboard screen, correct? Okay, perfect. So if you're familiar with Jamboard, then I'll just ask that you take a sticky note and you respond to this question, why you're here today. And it can be anything from, your boss told you need to be here, or you're interested in learning more about this topic. But first, I'm just going to share with everyone how to use this. So on the left-hand side, you'll see different tools. There's a pen, an eraser. This select allows you to add points. And so the sticky note is the one that we'd really like you to use today. And so I'll say, I am here to present at Mod, and then save that, and everyone should be able to see that I've posted that. And so we'd like to hear from others about why you're here today. So I'll just give you a little bit to think about, to share knowledge among a community of partners, to learn, that's great. Here to learn, yeah, that's great. Well, thanks, everyone. I just also want to, and while you're responding to that, at the very top of your Jamboard, there are frames, and we'll have other questions throughout, which we don't want you to answer yet. We'll prompt you when it's time to answer, but at the very end, there's an open space and question section. And so we'd like, throughout this presentation, if you have some thought, or if you'd like to share something that you feel like is not being addressed, you can either put it in the chat, and Camilla will be watching that, or you can put it in the Jamboard, and we'll hopefully have some time to get to that at the end of this presentation. And so since we're using this now, I'm going to ask everyone to minimize that so you can come back to this presentation. Thank you, everyone, for sharing why you're here today. And now we're going to move on to talk more about what it is that we're discussing. So first of all, what is diversity, equity, and inclusion? For many people, this term may be, these terms may be really familiar to you. And for many of you, it may not be familiar at all. And so we'd like to get everyone on the same page. And we're using some examples that are familiar to a lot of us because of being watershed managers or people who work with water. We're using fish as a species for an example. But I do want to say that diversity, equity, and inclusion relates to all species and all communities. And today, throughout this presentation, we'll be talking about people, but we thought this example would be helpful just to ground all of us. So diversity means plenty of variety. And so in green, you'll see when diversity exists, and in the red, you'll see when this is absent. So diversity exists when the stream has a variety of habitat to sustain many different species of fish. Diversity is absent when the stream is of poor quality and only able to sustain a few species, mostly invasive. So equity. Equity is basically a balance of opportunity. Equity exists when all the fish in the stream are living in harmony, each with access to sufficient resources to thrive at their own capacity. Equity is absent when the invasive species of fish are monopolizing all the resources, leaving very little for the few remaining native species of fish. Inclusion. Inclusion is accessibility and belonging. Inclusion exists when all the fish of all different shapes, sizes, and strengths are able to travel upstream and spawn. Inclusion is absent when only the most fit fish that can leap over the dam are able to travel upstream. So I know I went through that really quickly, but I hope it helps you understand a little bit about what these terms mean. And now we're going to talk about how these terms apply to systems change and planning and policy. So first, what is systems change? Systems change is a foundational change to a commonly used process that addresses a fundamental flaw. So the fundamental flaw that we're talking about today is that many communities have been expressing a lack of diverse, equitable, and inclusiveness, diversity, equity, and inclusiveness in their communities. And so we're seeing that being a result of some of the planning practices, some of the decision-making bodies. And so today we're talking specifically about planning and policy. And the reason for that is because planning and policy are long-term decision-making tools that have significant impacts to resource allocation across a community. So basically, these are tools that we are seeing need a systems change. And once we incorporate a change to bring DEI into these long-term decision-making tools, it will impact who gets funding, who gets practices put in their community, and that sort of thing. So what is the outline of today's workshop? And the reason I call it a workshop is because you will be having an opportunity to share your thoughts and ideas, and that will also help bring that conversation along. And so we'll share with you those points, as I said before. But to start, we'll be talking about, so we're going through a planning process with you today, basically, starting with initiating a plan. And we'll be talking about thinking historically during that time. Next, developing the plan, where we come up with these goals, issues, and implementation activities that will be later implemented when this plan is complete. So there, we're going to be talking about thinking synthetically. And then lastly, the implementation of the plan. Once that plan is complete, the community is going to go out, or the watershed district or watershed management organization is going to go out and say, all right, now we need to implement these activities that we've identified that we need to do to address these issues. And there we'll be talking about thinking together. And so these three types of thinking come out of a paper written in 2020, Advancing Water Equity Demands New Approaches to Sustainability Science. And Rebecca Walker, who's with us today, is a co-author of that paper, and she'll throw a link in the chat for you so that you can look at it later on, just to help guide this process if you're interested. So to begin, we will be talking about thinking historically. And this is a common thing that we do in a planning process. When we're initiating the plan and doing the watershed characterization, or some think of it as a land and water resources inventory, we look back to see what has been done already on this landscape. And so I'm going to now open up another audience reflection. So I'm going to ask all of you to open up your Jamboard, and I will pull the Jamboard up. And so we'll go to that second frame. And the question is, what resources are commonly used to explore the history of a watershed? So in your experience, if you've worked on plans in the past, what tools or resources do you use to look back and say, what's already happened on this landscape to help move forward with a plan? Local knowledge. Aerial imagery, absolutely. Aerial photos, yep, definitely. We look back and we see how has the land changed over time. Demographics, old maps, absolutely. Water quality data, yeah, so we look at monitoring data and we see how has the concentration of a certain pollutant changed over time. The Watershed Health Assessment Framework from DNR. Soil data, clean or contaminated. Landowner knowledge, yeah, great. So this is really great, and I'm seeing some things that we'll be talking about a little bit today. So thank you all for sharing your thoughts there. All right, so I'm gonna ask you all to bring your Jamboard down and come back to this presentation. So we talked about some of the things that we look back on, and some other things might be like watershed restoration protection strategies, plans that have already been developed in the past, watershed plans that we've already completed in our own districts, things like that. But the question is, what is missing from this picture? So commonly, one of the first things, the history of land ownership. So not just the history of how the land has changed over time, which we saw aerial imagery does show us that, how has imperviousness maybe increased in the landscape due to urbanization. The history of land ownership is a different question. It's about who owns the land now and who owned it before. And so we talk about this a lot with Indigenous communities. We're all on Indigenous land. So if we go way back, but even thinking back 10 years or 5 years, maybe in a rural area, we're seeing that what used to be a lot of family farms is now owned by corporate farming, or what used to be an area that had a lot of home owners is now a lot of rental units that are owned by people who don't even live in the state. And so how does that affect our decision making? It's an important question. But also it impacts the cultural values of the land. So when new people are living on the landscape, or people who maybe don't even live on that landscape own properties, how does that affect what they value, and maybe how they might support decisions that are being made about what plans should be put in place, or what practices should be put in place. Next, the history of decision-making bodies and their role in setting priorities. Over the course of history, we've had different people in place in a decision-making role, and they have impacted based on their biases and their perspectives on what is important. They have impacted what we have prioritized. And so how has that changed our landscape? And then lastly, land acknowledgements. This is becoming more and more popular, and I don't really like using the word popular and shouldn't really use that, but it's becoming more common that people are looking back and acknowledging that we are on Indigenous land, and acknowledging the harm that has been done to those communities, but also how that's changed the stewardship of the land and the values and the cultural values of the land, like I was mentioning before. So now we're going to go into examples of how those missing elements affect our communities. And Rebecca Walker is going to be talking about that today. So now, Rebecca, I will hand it over to you.
Okay, and I'll tell you next slide when to move on. Great. So as Rosie mentioned, a lot of my research is really on sort of the history of how our historic policies of who could own land and live in different places have shaped environmental outcomes today. So I want to talk about a few policies that have shaped this, and maybe think about some of their impacts today on environmental quality. So on the left, I have a map of racially restrictive covenants in Minneapolis and its suburbs. Racial covenants were legal restrictions that were included in property deeds that prevented the sale of a property to people of color. They made it exclusive to being white only. And they were used primarily by real estate developers to create segregated, exclusively white neighborhoods. And they were used from the early 1900s until the Fair Housing Act of 1968. So this map was produced by the Mapping Prejudice Project, and it's for, as I said, Minneapolis and its suburbs. It covers all of Hennepin County. And they went through and they mapped every racial covenant in Hennepin County. And what's important to know about these is they created these exclusive spaces that were for just white people that then shaped who could own that land, and where people were able to purchase land, as well as sort of the value we ascribe to land. So that data is available for Hennepin County and soon will be available for Ramsey County, both at the Mapping Prejudice website and at the Minnesota Natural Resources Atlas. On the right, we have a map of redlining. This is for the city of St. Louis. And so you can see sort of the Mississippi River on the southern side of the city to orient yourself. And redlining maps were produced by the federal government, by the Federal Housing Authority's Homeowners Loan Corporation. And these were produced during the Great Depression and the New Deal era, when the federal government began to start insuring mortgages. And so the federal assessors would go to cities and give each neighborhood in the city a grade, from best, which is indicated in green, still desirable, indicated in blue, declining, indicated in yellow, and hazardous, indicating in red. And that's where we get the term redlining. That was those designations of hazardous. And these redlining maps were based on, sort of the age of the houses that were in these neighborhoods, but were also largely related to the racial categories of people living in those different neighborhoods. And neighborhoods that were home to people of color were almost universally redlined. And so that was really, again, reascribing value to land based on someone's race. And that shaped where people were able to purchase homes, and also to gain wealth through home ownership. All right, you want to jump? Oh, and then the redlining maps are available for cities across the US. So for most major cities, and they're available in a national database. And for Minnesota cities on the Natural Resources Atlas. Okay, great. So these policies, they really shape patterns of infrastructure and environmental quality today. So again, on the left, looking at racial covenants, the top map is from a development in South Minneapolis, next to Diamond Lake. And this map was submitted by a developer to develop this land, and he went through and he submitted this map, and he added racial covenants to every property in his development. And then you can see on sort of the left corner of the map, this blob where he says this land is designated as a park for the park board. And what the developer was doing there was taking this piece of land that was a swamp that was really undesirable, and he gave it to the park board so that they then transformed it into a nice park to be a new green amenity for the residents of this neighborhood. And then you can see in the map below it, the red boxes are every property with a racial covenant, and the green there are the different park spaces. And so you can see the developer was successful in getting this swampland turned into a park to serve as an amenity for his residents. And so these patterns of race and privilege really shaped where investments in the environment were made. On the other hand, looking at the redlining map, this is again a map of St. Louis. And this researcher went through and she looked at where investments are being made today in green infrastructure. And those are those dots we see, the red dots we see on the map. And what she found is that today, green infrastructure investments are concentrated in neighborhoods that historically were redlined. And she wanted to understand sort of why this was. And this really had to do with, one, historically, which neighborhoods had a lack of investment in traditional gray infrastructural ways of managing stormwater, and today are more vulnerable to flooding, but also neighborhoods where land was cheap. And so as the city is trying to add more green infrastructure to its portfolio, they're buying up land, including lots that previously had affordable or low-cost homes, and they're converting it into green infrastructure. And so this really points to this tension between people's ability to live in a neighborhood and maybe a city or a municipality's desire to put in new green infrastructure, and how we need to be thinking really about these together to think about who's benefiting from this green infrastructure. And then finally, I wanted to, thanks. I wanted to expand out beyond just looking at cities. Lots of our work to manage water happens in rural spaces. And so to think about some of those forces shaping patterns of land ownership and cultural values in rural spaces. On the left, we have a map of the land that was ceded from indigenous tribal nations through treaties. And you can see, of course, all of the land that is today Minnesota was indigenous land, and how indigenous land has been reduced to just the reservation. So thinking about how this pattern of indigenous removal has shaped where Native peoples are able to access and manage land and resources. And similarly, tribal nations today maintain treaty rights to hunt, to fish, and to farm wild rice. And so they continue to have an active stake in how our natural resources and our water are managed, and are really important players to be thinking about when we're managing water bodies. Similarly, policy shaped who is able to move here to Minnesota to buy land, to receive federal loans. So I have an image of a Black farmer. Historically, Black farmers were denied federal loans for agriculture, and that made it really difficult to be a Black farmer. And then we can also think today about who owns the land, who works the land. Is it immigrant communities who are sort of on the ground and really like face to face with different environmental conditions and different land management practices? And are those voices being heard as we're developing our water management plans? And then finally thinking about who owns the land and sort of the economic costs of implementing different water management policies, and maybe the economic burden and the challenges faced by small family farms, and how they might be more inclined to sell their land, and sort of the cost that they might incur if they were changing farming practices. And so thinking about those tensions as we're trying to implement new water management policies in rural spaces. And Rosie, feel free to add anything to that slide.
Yeah, thank you so much, Rebecca. And I just want to highlight that this is looking back into history is something that is not always easy, and new tools are being developed every day. Data tools that are accessible to watershed management districts and watershed management organizations. And so it's a really great opportunity to be thinking about how can we explore this landscape in new ways that may reveal things about the social structures of how our practices harm or benefit the communities that we're working in. So now, go ahead.
Oh, sorry. And just to pivot to what you're about to talk about, Rosie and Belinda, but this thinking synthetically and thinking together, sometimes we don't have the data, sometimes we don't have a map that will reveal these policies, but really building relationships with communities can help us understand this history and how it's impacting people today.
Yeah, that is such an important point. Thank you, Rebecca. So here now we'll be talking about thinking synthetically. And so we've gone through and we've looked back into history in our watershed, and we're thinking about how land ownership has changed and how maybe certain policies and systems have impacted specific communities, and where we should be focusing our attention. And now we need to get to this point of identifying those issues, setting goals, and then ultimately developing the implementation activities that we'll be putting on the landscape. And so what is a traditional approach to doing this? So we'll commonly see in a planning process modeling tools like HSPF SAM to look at what are the pollutants on the landscape, where are they coming from, and what are the areas of greatest concentration or discharge of water, where is water flowing most quickly, most rapidly, and which areas are being most affected by it. Spatial data like land use, how has the land changed over time? Are we in more of an agricultural landscape? Are we in more of an urban landscape? What kind of pollutants might be coming from these different areas? As well as natural and public areas. Where are our spaces that are maybe protecting the land or filtering some of the runoff that we're seeing harming our water bodies? And then we'll have the policy committee as well as a citizen advisory committee and a steering team. And so they'll usually be kind of at the forefront of making decisions about where should we focus attention, what are our priority areas, what are our priority issues, and what goals do we need to set in order to address those issues in a measurable way. And then what activities do we think are feasible with the financial resources we have available and with the goals that we need to achieve. So, and I do want to note the Citizen Advisory Committee is typically a volunteer appointment from the community, people who have time available to come and share their thoughts and ideas, and coming from many different aspects of the community perspectives. So what is missing? Well, first, in a typical planning process, we don't see a significant time put on linking where people live and gather to the environmental planning. Who is impacted by these goals? We may say, okay, we want to address recreation because a lot of people have said that's something that is important to them. But then when it comes down to setting those goals and putting implementation activities in place, we're not asking in great detail, well, who is going to be impacted by the goal? Maybe a measurable goal to say, okay, we are going to implement X number of agricultural practices on the landscape. Well, who's going to be adopting those practices? Is it going to be the small family farms? Is it going to be the large commercial farming areas, or who's going to be adopting those? And who's going to benefit from those goals and those practices? And then respecting oh, did you want to say something, Camilla?
I did. I was just, thank you, Rosie. I was going to say there was a comment in the chat box that maybe we could address while we're talking about the synthetic thinking. Somebody asked synthesis and synthetic thinking. Is it the same thing? That's
a good question. So I guess when thinking synthetically is about thinking across synthetically, thinking about not just your own perspective in the world that we live in watershed management, but taking new perspectives and bringing them to the table, like housing. You know, we don't always think about how maybe people who are involved in housing development, you know, how are they going to think about a new project being put into place? And so I don't know if that answers the question, but I'll come back to that once I get through this, and you can share if that was helpful at all. So the next thing is respecting unconventional knowledge. Some common examples of this would be farmers. Farmers, while you know a lot of what they've observed may not be in peer-reviewed literature or in some of the monitoring data that we're seeing, they're observing a lot of changes on the landscape, and they're seeing what works and what doesn't work because they're out there on the land, they're seeing what's happening, and they're seeing how their communities are being impacted by it. And so it's really important to engage farmers, especially in an agricultural landscape, about are these practices even relevant or important? How do these goals impact your communities? Are they feasible? Will we be able to adopt these practices? Will Farmer John, your neighbor, be willing to take on a new wetland if they're a small farmer and they're already struggling economically? You know, these are just some questions that we need to be asking. And farmers have a lot of knowledge, generational knowledge that has been passed down to them, as well as Indigenous ways of knowing. As Rebecca mentioned, we have a lot of Indigenous communities in the state of Minnesota, and so and they do for generations and generations. They're the most original steward of the land, and so how has their perspective being incorporated into what strategies we're coming up with? They have a lot of knowledge about what has worked and what hasn't worked, and what are the best ways to work with the land so that we can achieve healthy environments and healthy communities. And then lastly, collaboration across disciplines. And this really speaks also to that synthetically, which is we know typically in a planning process, we're thinking about people who are going to be involved in implementing these practices, like in SWCD, soil water conservation districts, field staff, things like that. But what about transportation, people who are focused on transportation? How are maybe public transportation needs going to compete with the need for a new natural feature? Or how are the needs of a community that is predominantly low income, how do those needs of housing units, affordable housing units, compete with the need for natural space? And so all should be having the opportunity to have a healthy environment, but we don't want to take away their ability to other needs such as shelter and good quality food. Okay, let's see, moving on to the next. So tools and strategies, and I'll just kind of go over this quickly, but so what are some tools and strategies for incorporating some of these missing concepts into this aspect of the planning process? So what we've done in the St. Louis River One Watershed One plan is we encouraged the committees to think about who lives within these priority areas, who will be impacted by these goals, and who will implement these activities. So for example, putting a group of people together who are already working in the landscape and who have diverse perspectives, who maybe have an artistic perspective, or someone who is a community organizer, how may they think about the goals that we're setting and how it will impact the communities who live within that priority area. Next, an integrative process. So the moment you start bringing new perspectives into the table, you have to be open to changes as new information arises. As I said before, someone may say, well, actually, we live in this rental unit, and we know that like a lot of people are concerned about this area that we were hoping to be more housing because it's not affordable, and we want affordable housing is now going to be a park space. And so how do those competing challenges maybe change the way that we're going to structure our implementation activities? Well, maybe we'll put it upstream or in a different location where we can all still benefit, but it doesn't compete with another need in the community. And then incorporating new data like the Social Vulnerability Index into identifying social impacts. The Social Vulnerability Index is a really cool tool. That's a new tool where you can look at areas of different vulnerabilities across communities and where there's a higher concentration of vulnerability. And so how can we use that information to change the way we think about the spaces? And then lastly, and Belinda will go into more detail on this, but relationship building, making equalizing and accessible platforms so people can share their knowledge and their thoughts on matters without competing with a hierarchy. One-on-one meetings with farmers or Indigenous communities to just listen and allow them to share their own opinions and thoughts. And then going to places where people already gather. So now we're done with identifying our issues, goals, and implementation activities, and we're on to the next stage, which is implementing the plan. And so I'm just going to ask the audience to open up their Jamboard one more time. And we have this last question, which is, what inclusive and equitable strategies could be used to diversify your reach when receiving input on issues, goals, and activities for your specific watershed? So one size doesn't fit all. And I've talked about some of those strategies, but what tools might you be using in your watershed? So I'm just going to open up that Jamboard and let's see here. So some examples might be, an organization, okay, going places where people gather, exactly. Meeting with planning councils, holding listening sessions in community spaces. Yeah, these are great. So it's really a lot to do with going to where people are and listening to them. Table at diverse community events, learning more about the diversity in these communities. Exactly. So this is a great segue into Belinda's part of this conversation. Thank you for sharing. I'm sorry to cut off this time, but want to give Belinda an opportunity to share about the implementation piece. So Belinda, take it away.
Thank you, Rosie. Can everyone hear me okay? I'm coming to you from Capital Region Watershed District, so it's kind of empty here, but I just want to make sure that you can hear me just fine with my headset. So I'm excited to be here. Thank you, Rosie, Rebecca, and Camilla. I'm really excited about sharing with you some of our challenges, a few examples of how we're implementing DEI within our district, internally and externally, and give you an example of our commitment to this work. And so we're really going to be talking about how we put this all together. Next slide. And so a few of the challenges that we initially faced in before we could even implement the plan is to identify what diversity and inclusion meant to our organization. We understood that diversity and inclusion means different things to different organizations. And so we needed to first identify that for our organization. And so after doing that, we needed to identify the resources. This became a challenge for us because we realized that within our area, the DEI vendors, contractors were scarce. And so we had to do a lot of networking and figure out who we could use to help us put together our initial DEI plan, who was going to help us do the implementation plan, and we needed training, who was going to do the training. And so we had to overcome that challenge. We also had to identify what our own unconscious bias would look like. And so with our partners' recommendation, we took the Harvard Implicit Bias Test. And after that test, we realized that, everyone has bias. And so once we realized that and overcame that challenge, we were able to better acknowledge diverse perspectives, internally and externally. Next slide. And so I'd like to share with you a few of our goals and priorities, and this is part of our DEI plan. The first one is to create a more diverse and inclusive environment. The next goal, identify and address barriers to participation. Our third goal is to recruit candidates who truly represent our district for staff, board, and CAC. Our last goal is to advocate for diversity and inclusion. Next slide. And so part of our implementation, these are some of the areas that we needed to really address. We needed to address the terms. What is DEI? What are some of the terms? What is microaggressions? What are these DEI terms? And we had to spend some time discussing that and really getting on the same page with the board and staff about what that meant for our organization. We also realized that doing this work, diversity, equity, inclusion work, it's a lot different than our normal work. And so we needed to really adopt and embrace this shift from traditional linear plans that have a start time and an end time. And we realized that diversity work will truly be ongoing. With that information, we prioritized our work with the audiences that we realized were underserved by us. And so we realized that in order to prioritize that work, we were going to have to do things differently. And part of our implementation, and the reason why it's been so successful for us, is that we've built our DEI into our watershed management plan and our strategic plans, and that really does ensure the funding and our broader support for our work. Next slide. So I'd like to share with you an example of how we're reducing barriers. This is an image of our district, a map of our district. And if you can see in the area shaded yellow and the thick border yellow, that is the area of concentrated poverty. We were able to get this information with the help of a Green Corps member and staff doing the research of our participation within our stewardship grant program. We realized that this area is largely underserved by our district. And so we were able to implement a program, ACP 50 program, to help participation with those folks in that area by offering higher grant awards and increasing promotion efforts. We were able to do that by collaborating with district planning councils and community groups. And we are so proud of that we were able to get this information, because it just gives us that knowledge that we need about who it is that we should be identifying and focusing our attention on increasing participation. Next slide. Another example of how we're leveraging our DEI work is by focusing on building relationships. We talked in this presentation about Indigenous communities, and the district we were able to, over the past few years, connect with members of the Dakota, Ojibwe, and other Indigenous communities. With that relationship, together we developed materials that acknowledge their history and ongoing engagement in the stewardship of the land and the water in the district. We worked with the St. Paul Parks and the Lower Phelan Creek project, and we created story stroll signs, and that helps us identify and see the connections between the Dakota people and Phelan Creek. And lastly, we also adopted a land acknowledgement statement. And I'll talk about that next. Next slide. And so to wrap up, I'd like to give you another example of our commitment. The following is the CRWD Land Acknowledgement Statement. I'd like to read that for you. Capital Region Watershed District acknowledges the Dakota peoples on whose land we meet. We thank the Dakota peoples and their relatives for their care of the land, and we recognize their continuing connection to the land, waters, and community. We pay our respects to the Dakota and their culture, both past and present. We pledge to treat this land honorably and respectfully. This land acknowledgement statement is located in all of our plans on our website, and we will also, when we can gather in person, we will also make this statement as well. So with that, I'd like to thank everyone for listening. I'd also like to say, if you want to continue this conversation today on diversity, Administrator Mark Donay and I have a forum at 1 o'clock, and we'd love for your participation if you'd like to join us to continue this conversation. It was a little shameless plug, I know, but thank you for listening, everyone, and I'd like to pass it back to Rosie.
Thank you so much, Belinda, for sharing all the great work that the Capital Region Watershed District has been doing. And this is so important because by focusing on DEI and having a plan, we're working on who is implementing this plan, what relationships do they have with the community that's going to be impacted by the plans and the work that the Watershed District does just in general. So in conclusion, we have 3 really key points that we'd like to take away that we'd like you to think about over the course of a planning process. And we know this is iterative. We never stop doing this. We never stop going back to the initiation of a plan. And so thinking historically is key. Remembering some of the tools that we talked about today. And I saw someone asked about the Social Vulnerability Index that's available in the Minnesota Natural Resources Atlas. And if you're not familiar with that resource, you can just type it in and there's an interactive web mapping tool. But also if you just type in Social Vulnerability Index, that's available online and you'll be able to find that on a census block level. So we'll start by thinking historically, seeking out historic changes that reveal specific impacts to people. Then developing the plan, thinking synthetically, thinking across disciplines, outside of the boxes that we normally think in, bringing those perspectives to the table so that we're not competing with other important aspects of our community and creating a holistic plan that benefits everyone, as well as incorporating that socially relevant data, which I just mentioned. Implementing the plan, thinking together. And Belinda really touched on this in her talk about building relationships. This is so key to all the work that we do. And being an iterative process, when you build relationships, those are long-term relationships. So when you come back to thinking historically, like Rebecca was saying, tools and data are not always available to us. And so once you have those relationships in place, you can tap into new knowledge and new perspectives that you may have not previously had. And so those are the key takeaways we want you to have: thinking historically, thinking synthetically, and thinking together. And again, that paper that Rebecca may have shared in the link is such a great resource, and I highly recommend taking a look at it. And so I was just going to end off. I know we only have a couple of minutes left, and I don't know how much time we have for questions, but we'd love to open it up for questions and also share our contact information. As Belinda said, you can continue this conversation later on at 1, but also long-term, we want you to go away feeling like you have a connection and you have a resource, and feel free to reach out to any one of us. And we would be happy to talk to you about or connect you with someone who could help you as you go about this journey yourself. So thank you, everyone, and I'll open it up for questions.
Thank you, Rosie, Rebecca, Belinda. This has been a very inspiring conversation, and I'm sure a number of people will go back to look at the recording. There's lots to revisit here. Does anybody have any questions for Rosie, Rebecca, or Belinda?